a passionate search for truth.
The idea that the individual can decide for him or herself
Sparks decades of warfare and bloodshed. The Protestant Reformation.
Nobody wanted to invent a new church.
It inspires political upheaval.
King Charles had been beaten in battle, and that showed God's displeasure with him.
Leads to the conquest of new lands.
Who bids £4? Anybody?
Is used to justify slavery.
They had the Ten Commandments, they were good citizens all the way, and every one of them preached that slavery was God ordained.
And is a weapon for freedom.
The legacy of the Reformation seems more real today than it has to the last 100 years.
Without the Protestant Reformation, there would be no scientific revolution, no pilgrims, and no United States of America committed to an ideal of all men being equal under God. In many ways, the United States is the most religious country in the Western world. A vast majority of Americans say they are religious, and Protestant Christians make up the largest single religious group in America. The Reformation that created Protestantism affects nearly every aspect of modern life.
I think in terms of our everyday world, there's so many legacies of the Reformation which are almost taken for granted now, which have become seeped into our modern, increasingly secular culture.
Our Father, who art in heaven.
The Protestant community is a diverse one, taking in everything from ministries in the evangelical tradition to urban churches catering to gay parishioners. It was not always this way. Christianity was once a monolithic religion, with traditions not of questioning and rebellion, but of doctrine and obedience. As the 1500s dawn, the Roman Catholic Church dominates almost every aspect of European life. Political boundaries mean little, since even kings bow down to the Church. In a sense, the Pope is the ruler of the Western world. Challenging the Catholic Church, either politically or spiritually, seems unthinkable.
Its main source of power was that it taught, and people really believed, that if they made a misstep, they would burn in hell forever, and if they were on the right side of things, they would have bliss forever.
But the Church's leaders do not always behave in accordance with their dictates.
Priests having wives or taking money for forgiving sins is an old story in the Church. The interesting point is now people looked more critical at the Church because they were now more concerned with their own piety and also the question of the afterlife.
In 1492, the year Christopher Columbus first reaches the New World, Pope Alexander VI becomes the head of the Church. Alexander is from the Borgia family, notorious for corruption and decadence. Although all priests in the Catholic Church are supposed to be celibate, Alexander has had several children with his mistresses.
I think every Catholic historian of the last 30, 40, 50 years would say that the papacy was at its lowest point. The Borgia family and other families, political figures, princes, were essentially buying the papacy.
To fund this elaborate lifestyle, the Pope targets his rich enemies. They are accused of trumped-up crimes, imprisoned, and often murdered. Afterwards, the Church confiscates their properties. On one infamous night, according to widely told tales, the papal palace hosts a grand orgy. 50 prostitutes writhe on a floor scattered with chestnuts. Priests and other officials who perform with the most women are given prizes. Many people are outraged by stories like these. But in 1517, one man in this tiny German town of Wittenberg will turn the course of church history.
It is remarkable that a monk got this all started in an obscure university town. And I always compare it to there's gasoline all over the garage floor, and all Martin Luther had to do was toss a match.
Born in 1483, Martin Luther is originally headed for a career as a lawyer, a career he took up at the insistence of his father.
There's none of that sort of revolutionary, rebellious nature in the background of Martin Luther. There's nothing which gives you the indication this was a man destined to confront the Catholic Church or change European history.
But at 21, Luther commits his first act of rebellion, leaving his family and his studies to become an Augustinian monk. For the next 12 years, Luther tries to find peace within the teachings of the Catholic Church.
You have to understand that Luther was a good monk. He did all the right things in the old system. He said Mass, he went to confession. But gnawing away at him was a sense of unworthiness, of an angry God.
Luther wrote,
I scrupulously carried out the penances which were allotted to me, and yet my conscience kept nagging. You fell short there. You were not sorry enough. You left that sin off your list.
life in the monastery is made up of hard work, frequent prayer, and fasting. As a monk, Luther is obsessive in his search for personal purity and struggles to understand his relationship with God. His confessions are epic in their length.
There are not a lot of sins you could do in a monastery, and he really had to work at it. But he could confess for 6 hours. One time his confessor said, "Brother Martin, you don't have to confess every fart to me. It doesn't have to be that serious."
That was at the core of Luther's angst, this haunting question, have I done enough to please God? What is my posture in the presence of this demanding God of a church that requires so much from me to be acceptable?
Luther scours the Bible for answers while teaching theology in the small university town of Wittenberg. The last straw for Luther, a church practice that scandalizes him, the selling of what are called indulgences.
It was believed that while none of us could pile up enough good works to be saved, the saints had done a superabundance of them. And they developed a kind of a treasury of merits and graces that could be drawn upon.
Access to that treasury is what the church sells to the people, for themselves, for friends, for loved ones who have already died, or even for sins to be committed in the future.
This is a so-called letter of indulgence. People believed that it was a kind of insurance. Not a life insurance, but an afterlife insurance. The idea being that once you've bought such a letter, you could safely go to heaven. And of course, the letter is printed, meaning mass production. The letter is in Latin, meaning an official church document. You have blank spaces for the name of the buyer, and also the date is filled in by hand and the price for which it has been sold.
What Luther could see in the Bible was no justification for this, that this was a completely man-made tradition, almost a scam. And as a result, he was incredibly worried for the salvation of those people who were buying into it.
The man who sells indulgences around Wittenberg is a Dominican friar, Johann Tetzel. Tetzel is part preacher, part huckster.
He would come into town with a bandwagon, create a big crowd, and there's this wonderful phrase of, "Every time I hear the money fall into the pot, another soul escapes to heaven." He was one of the Catholic Church's great showmen of the mid-16th century.
For Martin Luther, this spectacle is a sign that the Catholic Church has lost its way. He fears for the souls of those who think that their fate in the afterlife can be bought. Luther turns to the Bible for an answer.
The progress of Martin Luther from a good Catholic monk to the father of the Reformation is a long, tortuous intellectual process. At the heart of it is a reading of the Bible and a rereading of the Bible.
He finds a passage in Paul's letter to the Romans that will set in motion an unstoppable chain of events.
When Luther read Paul, he saw the same agony, but he also saw the affirmation that God will save. Regardless of the fact that you and I are utterly worthless, God will save us in his infinite love.
The passage reads, "For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith."
He who through faith is righteous shall live. You don't need all the traditions of the church. You just need that powerful individual relationship with God.
It is a revolutionary idea. Salvation comes not from the man-made rituals of the church, but by faith alone. This means that not the Pope, not the Vatican, not even a priest is necessary to ensure a person's entrance into the kingdom of heaven.
Luther explained that for the first time, when he found out the true meaning of this quote in Romans, he felt he understood in a moment the whole of the Word of God.
And that set Luther free, and of course set the Reformation in process.
For Luther, this is a shattering personal revelation. He has no way of knowing that it will turn the Vatican upside down, launch wars and revolutions, and ultimately become one of the most important events in the history of the Western world. What happens next is the stuff of legend. On October 31st, 1517, the 33-year-old priest follows a time-honored tradition.
If you've ever been on a campus, you've seen a bulletin board where there are 8 layers deep of things posted, and they're usually announcements. And at this particular church, at this particular university town, one of the most popular things would be to put a note up, they're going to have a debate.
Luther wants to start his debate with a set of ideas about what is wrong with the church. His so-called theses, 95 in all, are formally titled Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. They go beyond the sale of indulgences to address the limits of papal power.
They were not meant as a general criticism on the practice of indulgence selling. The criticism was just mildly asking if it would not be better to help your neighbors than just buying letters of indulgences.
What you must remember about the beginning of the Reformation is that nobody wanted to invent a new church.
He wanted a debate within the church. He wanted to have this discussed and resolved within the authority of the church.
That doesn't happen. In writing his theses, Martin Luther is setting himself up for a showdown with Pope Leo X, the most powerful man in the Western world. Yet the Pope's authority will not subdue the German monk. Martin Luther will stand firm.
And that's the thing about Luther. Once he'd come to that viewpoint, he wasn't going back on it.
The devout young man has no idea what he is about to unleash.
I'm not sure Luther's intent was to set loose the Reformation that has really changed the world, but it certainly was the consequence of what he did.